My name's Lindsay Day, and I'm the DataStream Program Manager at the Gordon Foundation. Joining today from Peterborough, Ontario, which is Anishinaabe-Haudenosaunee territory. So we'll start with, I'd like to start with a quick round of introductions so that people on the call can get to know you a little bit. So we'll go around, maybe we'll move from east to west. So starting with you, Shanna, if you could let us know who you are and what you do.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today. So my name is Shanna Fredericks, and I'm the Assistant Director at Coastal Action. And we are an environmental nonprofit based in the southwestern region of Nova Scotia. And we do a pretty wide variety of environmental projects and programs, but most of them fall within our 5 key research areas. Sorry, I just spilled my water on my computer. And those are species at risk and biodiversity, coastal and marine, climate change, environmental education, and watersheds and water quality. And that's us in a nutshell, and I'm going to have to dry up this water.
Shanna, the exact same thing happened to me earlier this week. I spilled a full glass of water on top of myself at the start of a Zoom call, so I feel you. Alice, why don't we move on to you?
Sure. I hope your computer is okay, Shanna. It seems to be your stream is okay. So my name is Alice Cohen. I'm an associate professor at Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, or in Mi'kmaq. My background is in water governance, water politics, and so I'm here not representing a particular watershed stewardship organization, but as someone who's interested in how these organizations work and has spent a lot of time studying them and learning about what happens with the data after it's been collected. So really looking forward to the talks today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Alice. And Chelsea?
Hi, everybody. My name is Chelsea Lobson. I'm the Programs Director at the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, and LWF has been coordinating the Lake Winnipeg Community-Based Monitoring Network since 2017, which is a network of citizen scientists and watershed partners working together to collect water samples for phosphorus testing. I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about it in the conversations. Thanks.
And then last but not least, Bruce, who is filling in today for Melody.
Good afternoon. I think that's probably fairly clear that I'm not Melody. She does send her guts and has asked that I step in to speak about the program that they've been running. So about 12 years I've been working with the Mikisew Cree First Nation, who are a First Nation up in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta, northeastern Alberta. And the Mikisew Cree have a community-based monitoring program there. So we've designed that and been running that with about 4 or 5 full-time staff doing a wide variety of issues. I would say I'm also a board member for the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, so I get to see that data and that process as well, which is really exciting to compare someone across the region. So excited to hear from counterparts out on the East Coast as well today. So thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, guys. We're really excited to have you here. So for our first round of questions, we'd like to hear a little bit more about the why behind your work. So what are the issues of concern that led to setting up the monitoring programs? Tell us a little bit more about what motivates these. And maybe we'll just go back in reverse order. So starting with you, Bruce.
Well, there's a lot of issues in northeastern Alberta. Like what started the community-based initiative really had to do with the elders in the community, and of course in Fort Chipewyan, northeastern Alberta, there's the Dene, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, and the Mikisew Cree, and they all live in the same community, and some of their territory overlaps. So there's also the Fort Chipewyan Métis Association. So when I say elders, I say fairly broad sweep there, but they've seen a lot of negative changes in the homeland there. You can see behind me, the Peace Athabasca Delta is drying, and there's quite a lot of malformations and other noticeable environmental changes. And so I think for the elders who lived through this and had seen this firsthand and witnessed this, it was a little crazy making that the regional monitoring programs were just saying, no, everything's fine, when they knew it wasn't fine. And so they really were looking for a way to build a program that could not necessarily see if anything's going wrong, but sort of get a better sense of, let's look at what we already know is changing and why. And so we really took that approach, I think, in bringing science to complement the Indigenous knowledge in the region, and sort of tried to build a program that complements, where possible, the two knowledge sources again, and getting the best evidence for evidence-based decision making. And that's been, obviously a journey of initially trying to figure out where to focus limited resources, and then how to properly engage science and Indigenous knowledge, how to do communications, and certainly how to manage data. And that's been something we really tackled very early, and I think have some pretty robust solutions for, and are pretty proud of. So we've also then realized that in our setup, we've needed to become a little bit more regional. So we are involved in the wider oil sands monitoring program, which represents about 52, 55 Indigenous communities. And we're really trying to demonstrate some leadership there in terms of how our standard operating procedures are done, and how our sampling can speak to the other regional partners to see what's going on. And what's going on, it really is oil sands development. And so there is quite a lot of development on the Athabasca River. So the Peace Athabasca Delta, the Athabasca flowing north through the oil sands production into the delta where the communities live. They're also impacted by hydro development on the Peace River, so the Peace being the other major river that forms the delta. And so overarching, there's some serious climate signals that we're seeing, climate change signals. So we've got a really cumulative effects problem going on, where there are three different stressors in the region, and so it's complicated for sure. It's complicated to the degree that the ability to make changes in working with the provincial government, Alberta, and the federal government actually led the Mikisew, led by Melody Lapine and her leadership, to go to the International Union Conservation of Nature and really take our arguments outside of Canada into the international arena. And so there's a really important decision coming back this Monday to see if the Wood Buffalo National Park will be listed as threatened, because it is a UNESCO site and it is in peril. And so the communities have been advocating that more serious attention is given to it. And so there's a lot going on. I'll stop there and just let you know, but there's multiple reasons for why we're seeing the need to build this program and link it regionally. And so again, super excited to see what other folks are doing here across the country to learn from. So thanks.
Bruce. And then moving on to you, Chelsea. I know the Lake Winnipeg Foundation's program is focused on a very specific issue in Lake Winnipeg. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so just to begin, I guess Lake Winnipeg is the world's 10th largest lake, and it's recognized nationally and internationally for its ecologically and culturally important habitats. But unfortunately, over the last few decades, Lake Winnipeg has experienced an increase in frequent and severe blue-green algae blooms. And but luckily, we have the decades of research from the experimental lakes area that tells us that phosphorus is the nutrient responsible for these blue-green algae blooms on Lake Winnipeg. And so if we want to address those blooms, we need to reduce the phosphorus loading coming from the watershed. And so that sounds easy, right? Just reducing the phosphorus loading from the watershed. But if you've seen a map of the Lake Winnipeg watershed, you'll know that it's huge. So it spans from west of Calgary to west of Thunder Bay, dips into 4 US states. And sometimes when we think about addressing phosphorus loading across that whole watershed, the challenge of improving the health of Lake Winnipeg can seem insurmountable. Especially as Manitobans who get to enjoy Lake Winnipeg, worrying about what they're doing in Alberta or North Dakota can just make the challenge seem impossible. And so the goal of the Lake Winnipeg Foundation was to use high resolution phosphorus data to more accurately pinpoint phosphorus hotspots in the watershed, where we could target action and remedial action, target resources and remedial action to reduce phosphorus loading to Lake Winnipeg. But when we went to go look for this data, we weren't able to find it. And we realized that was for a few reasons. So one of them was that for phosphorus data, it's really important to be sampling frequently during the snowmelt period. So that's when lots of the phosphorus is running off the land and into our waterways with snowmelt, and then responsively to large rain events throughout the season. And so you can imagine for a centralized organization, if there's a big rain event across the southern portion of the province, running out to grab a sample from the hundreds of sites in that area would be logistically challenging, to say the least. And so the Lake Winnipeg Foundation thought that citizen scientists could have a role to play in collecting this data. They could, they live, work, or commute near their sampling site, and so can collect those samples during the key periods to accurately estimate phosphorus loading and identify those phosphorus hotspots in the watershed. And so that's what we've been doing since the program began in 2017. We've noticed some trends now over these last years of collecting data. There's regions that consistently pop up as hotspots that we now feel confident that we can say, okay, we need to be working in these areas. We need to be directing action and into these spots and we have to if we really want to improve the health of Lake Winnipeg. And yeah, really, we're always looking for interesting ways to use this data, and so really excited to hear what everyone else has to say about their programs across the country.
Thanks, Chelsea. And Shanna, I'll turn it over to you next. Do you want to tell us a little bit? I know Coastal Action does a lot of different things, but could you, tell us a little bit more about the why behind some of your programs and the issue of concerns?
Sure. So we have a few different monitoring programs for different reasons. But the one I'll talk about today is kind of a success story where we did manage to move data to action. So it's kind of a good example. And it involves the Lehave River in southwest Nova Scotia, where our long-term monitoring program combined with a citizen science program and a 13-year-old's science fair project all kind of came together to result in a $17 million cleanup program on the Lehave River to remove hundreds of illegal straight pipes, which were dumping raw, untreated sewage into the river for many, many years. So it all kind of began with a study in the 90s where they identified over 800 of these illegal straight pipes still in operation in the river, just in the estuary portion, so about 20 kilometer stretch of the lower reach of the river. And then our monitoring program, which covers the whole Lehave watershed, began in 2007. And we were seeing, a lot of chronic bacteria contamination issues down in the estuary, most likely attributed in large part to these straight pipes. And we would share that data every year with our local municipalities and with the public. But we weren't getting as much traction as we wanted to. And so we decided to add a little citizen science component where we were able to sample, really focus on the estuary and sample at a higher frequency, more sites, because we were able to use some lower cost rapid enterococci testing cards with an incubation method that could be done at home. And so we started to publicize those results on a weekly basis through the summer, and actually started to get some attention from the public, and people were starting to learn about straight pipes. And one person who caught on to that information was a 13-year-old girl named Stella Bowles, who decided that she'd like to take it on as a science fair project. And so we set her up with our citizen science group, and she began using the same technology, these rapid testing cards with a simple filtration system and an incubator. And then she began to publicize her results on Facebook, and very quickly those went viral, and she gained quite a bit of national attention. And that's when things really started to move. There was a public groundswell and an outcry, and people, couldn't believe that this had been going on for decades and decades. And that's when things really started to move, and the municipality applied for a large infrastructure grants from the province and the federal government, and put together this program to create a wastewater management district around the estuary, which basically forced every homeowner within that district to prove that they had a certified system. And if they didn't, then they were given financial support to replace it and put in a certified system. And that program is now coming to an end. By 2023, they expect to have all of the straight pipes in the estuary replaced with systems. And so we hope to see significant improvements in the bacteria conditions in the estuary.
It's an amazing story.
That's the story of the Lahey River.
Alice, I know you bring a bit of a different perspective to this. Like you mentioned, you're not engaged in a monitoring program yourself, but you have done some research around what makes effective monitoring programs and how that data is getting used. So I'll hand it over to you to speak a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. So as you mentioned, yeah, I'm not going to speak to any particular program, but maybe I'll start with a little bit of background. So I worked in 2014 with a master's student, Tyler Carlson, and we both were asking the question, okay, CBM is becoming increasingly popular across the country. More jurisdictions are providing funding and support. DataStream is coming online, which was really exciting. And so, I went looking for the data, like how many CBM programs are there in Canada, and where are they, and what are they measuring, and how are they funded? And that data was not out there. And so I worked with Tyler, and we developed a report, and I can send that to Lindsay if it would be helpful to share around later. But that came out in 2015, and really, which feels like 6 years ago. And so, we said, okay, well, we think there are, a few hundred organizations, and we wrote to them and we asked them a series of questions around how they were funded and what kind of monitoring protocols they were using. And one of the many questions was, is your data getting used? And an amazing 50% said, I don't know. And we're like, well, that's really interesting, right? It was close to 50%. I can't, So they said, we don't know. And so we thought, okay, well, that's really interesting. And so then I ended up working with the Atlantic Water Network, Emma Waddy, and Aislinn, and then we also partnered up with Coastal Action with Shanna and Brooke Notting there, and say, well, okay, well, let's look at this at the Nova Scotian scale. So let's actually get into the weeds here and talk to people working at CBM organizations and talk to people working in government and try to figure out, is the data getting used and how is it getting used? And if yes, what's happening with it? And if the answer is no, why not? Like, what are the barriers? What are the obstacles? And so to that end, we held a workshop in February of 2020, right before, feels like a whole other world, but we had a workshop in that February. And then we had Aislinn carried out a series of interviews. There was a report that came out of that. And really what we were trying to kind of get at was, like, are data getting used? And if the answer is yes, what is it getting used for? And if the answer is no, why not? And so it turns out that we weren't the only people asking this question. So my department head here said I should call my research beyond data mania, which I think should be the alternate title for the work that I'm doing. But we're not the only people asking that question. So people have been looking at these kinds of questions around the world, really, in places where CBM has been in place for quite a while. And so there was a report that came out of the work that I did with the Atlantic Water Network and with Coastal Action. And again, I can send that to Lindsay if it would be helpful to circulate that. And we looked at what other places were doing and how to encourage data sharing, if that's one of the goals of the program. So I'm actually going to share my screen and just give an example of one of the places that is doing that. So just can everybody see that? So this is from the Chesapeake Bay Water Monitoring Cooperative in the United States, and they've divided their data into three kind of sets of data. So you can see their tier 1 data is data that's used primarily for education or ecosystem health screening. Tier 2 is data that's used for ecosystem health report cards, health screening, targeting management actions. And tier 3 is where you're informing policy and data management. And as you can see from the lime green arrows going up the side, in the experience of the Chesapeake Bay Water Monitoring Cooperative, as you go up the tiers of data, the time, rigor, and expense gets higher, and there are increasing QA standards. What we heard in the webinar in the case of Nova Scotia is that time, rigor, and expense are not always that closely intertwined. Something can be cheap but take a really long time, or really expensive but not a lot of work, so that those are not as tightly connected necessarily in the Nova Scotian experience as they are as represented here. So this is an example. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, but that's an example of one of the ways of maybe thinking about data collection. And as I'll talk about maybe a bit later, because I know I'm coming to the end of my time here, you know, is success always defined by informing government policy? So there are many different kinds of ways of measuring success, depending on the actual goal of the program from the outset. So I'll come back to that later. But yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thanks, Alice. And a great segue into sort of the next round of questions that I'd like to present to our panelists. We've heard about really an amazing diversity of programs informed by different concerns. I'd like to turn the conversation now to where you think that your programs have seen success and what you think are some of the factors contributing to that. So I think our last order worked well. Why don't we go that way again, starting with you, Bruce, if that's all right?
For sure. Yeah, for us, it's about evidence-based decision making, and so you know, using data and planning what you're going to collect to really is the name of the game. And so we've been employing an environmental effects monitoring framework for what we're doing. But the main point is to be able to give the leadership understanding about how their treaty rights are being impacted. So this is the Section 35 rights for the First Nation and the Mikisew, then track, you know, water quality, changing ice conditions, fish health, etc. But with the goal in mind to see how that data is trending and if it's moving in a negative direction towards something that would be, you know, what they've self-articulated as their own internal policy. So Alice, I think the segue for me on that would be like the communities have every right to create their own you know, line in the sand, so to speak, of threshold not to be crossed. It may not be respected legally in some instances. We have been fighting for example, the Aboriginal extreme flow, the base flow needed in the Athabasca River, what the communities who live and use and put their lives on the line to go out on the land consider safe is not what industry and government considers safe, but they make the rule. So these are the things that we're trying to do. So we're measuring against that. And I think for our data collection in particular, I can give you one real specific example. But first, I wanted to mention that we have two kind of streams of data, sometimes complementary and sometimes not. So we do collect Indigenous knowledge indicators. And some things really specific. So if we're collecting fish health endpoints, weight of the liver, for example, in a fish compared to its body size, the elders who make the dry fish and have been fishing for the last 40, 50 years in that location are also giving us really specific indicators on the amount of fat on the stomach or their liver size and liver color, firmness of flesh, etc. So we do have two kind of data sets that we get to play against each other. It's really fascinating. So that's the community itself had asked us to use data, as I mentioned, to sort of co-validate their words, really what they've been seeing and some of their knowledge. And so in some cases, the data has done that. And I think what you can use the data for in this instance is to create an arena in which Indigenous knowledge is taken at face value and is considered. Real simple example, elders have always told us that muskrats build a muskrat house at the end of the year or at the end of the late fall, and they'll build it to a certain size. So if they're going to build it small, it means there's going to be a lot of snow, and the snow acts as a blanket of insulation, and vice versa. So we decided we go and we do a muskrat survey every year. We go around and looking for population of muskrats. So when we found them, we would measure the snow depth and the house height. And sure, after 5 years, we had about 550 data points. And there's a really nice inverse relationship. So the data says exactly what the elders had said, which, I mean, has to blow your mind a little bit that, you know, animals are aware of the hydrological cycle before it happens. And so it's not to say we know how to fully use that data, but we've done that for quite a lot of our work. And I think it really helps that you can do evidence-based decisions based on Indigenous knowledge, science. If you have both streams, even better. I think I maybe have a minute left here, but I'd really like to talk about the ice work that we've done, because I think it's pretty important. If you go out intentionally and collect for 10 years of ice thickness data at a variety of sites, lo and behold, it can tell you a lot. And so we're seeing clear signals that ice is not forming as much in December and January, which has implications for safety and getting out. From our 10 years of data, we've managed to create a mathematical model that can then go back into time. We've tested it for 10 years. We can take historical data on snow and temperature, and we've backtracked 100 years to show that there is about a 10 to 12 centimeter loss of maximum ice thickness in the Peace Athabasca Delta, which again corroborates really closely to what elders have said. You know, 1.5 feet, 2 feet of ice lost. So what we're trying to do, just to wrap up with this ice data, is create a model and start tracking how safety is changing on the land for communities. We're calling it ice travel duration. It was something we didn't come up on our own, but with the University of Alaska and IISD and Environment Canada. Basically, it starts tracking when safe ice starts in the season, about 30 centimeters, towards your maximum ice thickness. So we have that data for 10 years. We've established our monitoring triggers. We know what the natural variation is there. So now going forward, we can start to see what are the impacts of hydro development, Site Cs coming online, and climate change, to see, is there an actual decrease in the amount of time communities can safely go and access their treaty rights. So it's a nice way to tie in data collection management through to an actual concrete thing you're trying to track towards. Hope that made sense.
That's a really interesting example, Bruce. Thank you. Chelsea, I'll hand it over to you. Do you want to speak a little bit about the things that you think have made the program successful, and where you've seen some advances being made?
Yeah, so the program was designed to target action to phosphorus hotspots, and we have seen some traction in that area. So for example, we partner with researchers who are using our hotspot data to target their field studies to the areas where they would have the greatest impact. So a group of researchers at the University of Winnipeg are doing this study on soil amendments to see if they reduce phosphorus runoff from flooded soils. And they've used our data to make sure that those field tests are being done in a phosphorus hotspot where if these soil amendments are successful, they would be implemented. And so it's been exciting to see our data used in that way. And then also watershed districts use our data to decide kind of where to put their projects. Watershed districts in Manitoba are the groups that do a lot of that on the ground, like beneficial management practice, retention pond kind of work. And so having them using our data to target their projects to where they'll have the greatest impact is really valuable. And then this isn't quite a success yet, but it's an area that we see a lot of opportunity for policy using our data, is through government funding programs. So for example, in Manitoba, we're in the Lake Winnipeg watershed, I guess we have the ECCC's Lake Winnipeg Basin program. And so having them use our data to target their funding to where it would have the greatest impact would be a huge value, I think, and ensure that their investment is actually effective at reducing phosphorus. And there are other provincial programs like that as well. And it seems kind of like a low-hanging fruit area to get our data into government policy and decision-making processes. Another area that we have seen some traction, and this kind of goes back to what Alice said about what is success for our program. So success for our program is phosphorus reduction, or phosphorus loading reduction from the watershed. And so if we are directing practices to hotspots, we need to know kind of what practices are actually effective at reducing phosphorus. And in Manitoba, because of our kind of unique climate and the flatness of the Red River Valley, we don't always actually know what phosphorus beneficial management practices are useful at reducing that phosphorus. A lot of them are imported from warmer places or hillier places. And so we began actually monitoring these phosphorus beneficial management practices for their phosphorus reduction impact to make sure that what is being done is also effectively reducing phosphorus loading. So that's been a really exciting kind of build off of our baseline data collection. And then another area we've seen traction, which doesn't have as much to do with data, but it's in the infrastructure of the network. So now that we have these people kind of on the ground ready to take samples, we've had a lot of interest from universities who, want to do a salinity study of the watershed as well. So they just kind of add their salinity vial into our sample pack. And the infrastructure of the network and the people on the ground, I think, has also been highlighted as a value as we see more unpredictable weather patterns and people, and there's a more intense rainstorms and stuff, and we need people kind of going out to grab those samples more quickly. I think the infrastructure again will be a huge value to water quality data in Manitoba. And I think that's everything. And I'm not sure about time, but hopefully it was okay.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. It's a really great example of what I think focused efforts can do in applying, to a specific issue and working with citizen scientists as well. Shanna, you shared a really neat example, and as you mentioned, a lot of things kind of came together to that end result. What do you think were the key contributors to success in your program and experience?
Sure. I think with the story of the LaHave, I think one of the key factors there was that we had over many years built a pretty strong, trusting relationship with our local municipal government through a lot of other collaborations and partnerships, information sharing both ways. So we had a really mutually beneficial relationship that was built over many years. And I think that played a pretty important factor in terms of, us kind of coming to the realization together that it was really time to act and do something here. And then they worked with us where we kind of led the education and awareness side of the program. As you can imagine, there was some resistance to a municipality basically taking ownership over everybody's sewer systems for 7 years. So there was some finessing and some education that needed to roll out before that program. And so I think that was an important part. And probably one of the biggest factors really was just that we tapped into and became aware of the power of youth. Stella's project and her platform, putting her results up on Facebook, that's really what pushed this program forward and actually got us to the point where these straight pipes are being replaced. And we've actually, in the past few years, she's much older now. She's 16-year-old, almost done high school, but she's still very much involved in this issue. And she now works for us leading a program called Nova Action, where we've gone out and found a whole cohort of youth across the province who are passionate about an environmental issue in their own community. We've set them up with mentors in their own communities, and they've all chosen an environmental issue to tackle on their own. And they're supported with some funding for collecting samples and that sort of stuff. So we've kind of taken this model of Stella and her success, and we've tried to sort of replicate it and see if we can have some more success stories in other parts of our province with young people.
Thank you, Shanna. I know that's something I've heard in many Indigenous communities that we've worked with as well, is this importance of youth engagement and getting youth involved. So it's a really interesting part of your story as well. So thank you. Alice, I'm going to hand it back to you to speak a little bit more about this.
Yeah, so first of all, those are all like really interesting examples. So thank you all for sharing those. I hadn't heard about the muskrats and the dam size and the snowfall. That's really amazing. So thank you for sharing that. So one of the things that, one of the central things that came out of the report with the Atlantic Water Network and with Coastal Action was this idea of the lock and the key. And so when we spoke with community groups and when we spoke with government, often we heard, we're collecting data that government can't use or it's not in their mandate, or government say we're looking for data XYZ and community groups don't have it. Because if they want E. coli data, for example, if the community groups are not collecting E. coli data, then it's not a good fit. So we talked about, okay, well, you need to have this kind of the lock and the key kind of have to fit together in some way if the end goal is managing policy. So I want to step back from that for just a second to Chelsea's point about defining success. And so when we were talking with CBM groups, really there were sort of two. Our first question was like, why are you doing community-based water monitoring? Like, why is this even happening in the first place? And there were really two sets of answers. So the first set of answers was like, we have a particular concern and we would like to have it addressed, whether it's like fish health, whether it's E. coli, whether it's phosphorus, whatever it is. We have this particular concern and we really want to see some kind of policy change, or like there's a data gap and we need to fill the data gap. We don't know, there are things that we don't know and we'd like to find that out. So there's that kind of like data side of it. There were a number of answers, though, that weren't that were like education. Kids don't know two kinds of education, really, either about where they live. You ask kids, like, where do you live? They know what town they live in. They probably don't know what watershed they live in. And also education about science, or maybe they do. Bruce is nodding. Maybe they do. Maybe it's different in Nova Scotia, or it depends on the Mackenzie Basin. It's like so huge, right? So it's different. But so education, but also science education. So how do you go out and collect data? And like, how does that all work? And so if the goal of a program is education and not policy change, you can't say, well, the program didn't lead to, it was a failure as a program. Well, no, if the goal was to get, 7-year-olds out and learning about science and learning about their watershed, then that is successful. So the first thing is, for community groups, the question of like what's been successful is really a function of what the goal is, right? So the goal doesn't always have to be making policy change. That's a good goal. It doesn't have to be the only goal. But I want to speak to that one because that's specifically what we're focusing on today. So as I mentioned, there's this lock and key idea, right? So if governments are looking for E. coli counts or phosphorus numbers, then the CBM programs in that place have to have the ability to collect that information, whether it's enough funding to pay for the lab analysis, whether it's the specific equipment that can go out and actually measure that specific thing, or whether it's like enough people to collect at enough data points. So if governments are looking for a particular piece of information, like the examples I gave, it's also important for them to fund and support in a long-term way programs that enable that kind of data collection, right? So it seems really obvious, but a lot of the success stories are in fact about, making sure that CBM programs have the things that they need, whether that's a physical piece of equipment or long-term funding or a certain number of individuals or boats or funding for lab analysis or access to lab analysis or like whatever it is to actually collect the data that is going to be useful, that is going to affect policy change. A second piece is just education among policymakers, right? So many people, policymakers that we talked about had heard about DataStream, which is great, but not everyone has. And not all the data is on DataStream, right? And so matching up, the availability of information with people who are looking for it. And then you get into political issues around the policy cycle, right? And so, there are moments where there are opportunities to make change, and then there are moments where those kinds of calls can fall on deaf ears. And so, like making use of those kinds of policy windows. So, when a jurisdiction says okay, we're gonna, our water policy as a province or as a territory at the federal level. Okay, well, there's like a moment to kind of get on the radar. And so what a lot of this really comes back to is communication, and Shanna talked about that in the case of Coastal Action, like long-standing relationships with the province, but having that ongoing conversation and having all the stakeholders in the room at the outset. If you're talking about setting up a CVM program, okay, so what are the concerns? What's our goal here? First of all, is it education? Is it improving water quality? Is it like, what is the end goal? And what kinds of information do we need to meet that end goal? And what do we need to get that information, right? Whether it's like expertise or lab analysis or tools or boats or people or whatever it is. And having all the people in the room or the virtual room or the Zoom call or whatever it is when those decisions are being made. So like one of the top recommendations out of the report is matching program funding to anticipated outcomes. So really kind of thinking through goals and so on. So the examples that Chelsea and Bruce and Shanna all gave are really good examples of cases where that has occurred. And that is sort of what we have seen across the province anyway, is that data is more likely to get used when it is in a format that's usable to policymakers, which again seems really basic, but is often sometimes so assumed that it isn't explicit. So that I don't have like the secret recipe to success. But one of the, the key recommendation is matching program outcomes with program design and funding, which is easier said than done, of course. Yeah, so we'll leave it there.
Thanks, Alice. You covered a lot of ground there, and I think all of those aspects are very relevant within the programs we've heard about today, and many of the others that we work with, both in terms of like where successes are happening, but also sometimes the challenges, when those pieces, sustainable funding, I know is an issue. Collaborations can be difficult. Building those relationships, takes time, and I think can depend on the people and the context. So, I want to leave some time for audience questions for our panelists. So I just want to do a quick round now before we open it up for everyone on the call, and folks on the call, if you want to, be thinking of your questions, you can use the chat to ask them, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in our time. But before I hand it over, just key takeaway messages. I'm wondering if we could go around and have you guys, if you had one piece of advice for our monitoring groups that are trying to affect change, what would that be? I know with the wealth of your experience, there can be many things, but if you want to just sort of pick one that you'd like to share before we hand it over. So I'm going to go in the order of my screen. So that means Chelsea, I'll hand it to you.
Sure, thanks. I think one of the things that makes our program successful is the focus on phosphorus. And so I think sometimes it can be tempting to do a lot of different, collect a whole bunch of different types of data. Since the volunteers are out there, like why not have them with the YSI and all these other things? But ensuring that, this data that we're collecting, we know how we want it to be used. We have the capacity to analyze it and put it into reports and communicate it back to people in a meaningful, accessible, understandable way is really important, and allows us to make sure that that data that's being collected can go through the full cycle of being analyzed and being used for targeting, and hopefully result in actual phosphorus reduction. So I guess thinking about, again, like what the concern is that you're trying to address, and being really focused in the approach, and not collecting so much that it's impossible to analyze it all and make use of all of that data would be my main kind of recommendation, I guess.
Thanks, Chelsea. And Shanna, do you want to share with us your thoughts?
Sure. I think having a multi-stakeholder approach from the start, I think, is really important. As you're designing your program and figuring out your end goals, inviting everybody to the table who has a stake in it, everyone who deserves to be there and have their voice heard. A lot of our programs where we've seen the most success have these sort of multi-stakeholder advisory committees And it can certainly be challenging managing competing interests, and isn't always, it's not always easy, but I think it does lead to greater success in the end, and including young people in that multi-stakeholder group.
Thanks. And Bruce?
There's a lot to choose from. I like the themes here, and I have to echo it. Like, knowing what your central questions are is pretty useful. And so if you're seeing general decline in the environment, you can't monitor everything effectively, so you choose something that's representative enough. And if you're doing fish health, then the next question is, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to answer at a community level, like, are your fish safe to eat, or are you trying to collect enough evidence to litigate? And that's going to change how you actually approach and the power you put into your sample sizes and things. So you can't do it, you can't go back and change it afterwards. So it really does require so I certainly like the multi-stakeholder approach. I'm a big fan of doing your homework, and so with the Indigenous context, where quite a number of years and interviews and time on the land with the elders to really, for me, for example, it's hard, even after doing this for 20 years, to trust at face value sometimes knowledge that you don't have rooted in your own kind of, for lack of a better word, ontology. I hate that word, but your worldview is tough to unlearn. So as a trained scientist, it's tough to unlearn things sometimes. So to go and sit and see it and feel it yourself, it does help. It doesn't have to, but put that time in, and so that you know what you're talking about. And I guess that's just stop there.
Awesome. Thanks, Bruce. And then Alice, I'm not sure, was that your sort of take home point there, was matching the lock and the key? I don't know if you have anything else you want to add. I do want to open it up also for questions. So to our attendees, please feel free to use the chat to pose any questions to our panelists, whether it's the whole group or if you have a question for a specific panelist. And Alice, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I was just going to echo what other people have said, but the importance of clearly articulating the aims of the program. That doesn't mean that they can't evolve over time, of course, but just being really clear on what the aims are enables groups to be clear on what they're asking for, whether it's like equipment or personnel or whatever. But also to target specific policy aims, and then the level of data, like as Bruce just said, are you looking to collect information for, background information, or are you looking to collect data at a level that will allow you to like litigate for environmental harms? Those are two really different kinds of data. And so just all of the background and the thinking through, and I know lots of that is already happening, and that's a key part of all the success stories. So I will leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Thanks, Alice. I think while we're waiting, if anyone in the audience has any questions, please post them in the chat. One of the things I think that came up through all of the panelists was various forms of sort of collaboration and working together, multi-stakeholder approaches, whether it's with governments. Bruce, you shared, working with UNESCO as well, taking it to the international stage. And also you spoke about the oil sands monitoring, which again is bringing many communities together, and governments and industry, which is, both, there's a lot of players there. I'm interested to hear from you guys. What do you think are sort of some key ingredients of successful collaborative efforts? I think it's clear collaboration is important, both within individual programs and also just water stewardship more broadly. It is an area where we all need to work together. So just some thoughts on what you think makes for a successful collaboration. And I'll leave it open to anyone to pipe in who's got something to say.
I was actually just going to echo what you said for your take-home message. So I think including the groups from the beginning. So for example, we've been working with the watershed districts since we were kind of thinking about how our program would look, as a group in mind that would kind of help us with the monitoring. They would also be really important for the community connections and finding volunteers in their regions, as well as a group that we would want to kind of use the data for that targeting of their projects. And so I think if you having a partner in mind, working with them from the beginning and having clear communications and updates and meetings and stuff is really helpful.
Lindsay, I could add capacity for the Indigenous communities, and we do forget that the entire infrastructure of Canada and possibly a large part of the world is geared towards science. Schools have science labs, science classes. They've got certainly universities and enormous research development grants all over the place, but the same infrastructure surrounding elders and that kind of deep-rooted Indigenous knowledge is largely absent. And so for a community to have their knowledge and for youth growing up to respect it, it's a very valid way to make decisions from. It's not given the same certain fair playing field. And so for us, it's always as researchers important to remember that we should build space for that to occur. That's important.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Bruce. I think that's a really important consideration, both within Indigenous communities, but as a country. And, you know, we need to create those spaces to be able to use many ways of knowing and knowledge systems together. So I think that that's really important, especially when it comes to collaborating, creating that awareness and understanding amongst others as well, that what these knowledge systems are and the value that they bring. So we do have a question in from the audience, so I'm just going to shift to that to make sure we have time to get to it. And the question is, which formats do you see as the most effective way to communicate the findings from your data for impact, and how might this differ by the target audience? So I think that is a really interesting question around how to best communicate the data and the findings from your project. Chelsea, maybe we could start with you, if that's all right.
Yeah, sure. So one of the ways that I think is best is honestly community presentations, like really going through the full like arc of the program and explaining to the groups that we're presenting to how they could use the data, I think is really important. Having the data openly accessible on a platform like DataStream is really helpful and allows the people who want to use it to download it. But I think sometimes we need to be a little bit more direct in how we want like people to use this data. So we want them to direct the efforts to hotspots. And so we put our data into maps that show exactly where the hotspots are, not assuming that someone's going to download the data and kind of do this all themselves. So really like kind of spoon feeding it to the folks that we want to be using it. Like, this is how you could be using it. This is how it would benefit your work. All of that, and a lot of it is in just continuously saying the same thing over and over in lots of presentations and reports and policy briefs and things like that.
There's some gardening, landscaping or something happening outside my window. Bruce, could you share a little bit? I mean, I think there are many audiences for the work that you were involved in. So yeah. Yeah,
openness, transparency of the data. So kudos open and platform like Mackenzie DataStream, where we put our data, allows other researchers to use it as they see fit, as long as they relate to you and give credit to it. But diversity of tactics for sure. Like, I'm communicating, we're writing journal articles, but we're doing community presentations. We have a data visualization platform. I think you're trying to target a variety of different end users and a variety of people with different comfort levels around technology, and so even languages. And so the diversity of tactics and be, I think, Chelsea, in terms of directed, like the hotspot maps, yeah, like you're tailoring something, so you're working with your partner to customize something, and that's usually has a really great return on your investment.
Thanks. Shanna, I think, communications played a really important role in so far as like the social media sort of sharing of results had a really big impact. That was from outside your organization, but what could you share around different ways of communicating for impact?
Sure. Sorry, my mouse pad seems to be damaged from my water spill, so I missed part of the question, but yeah, communicating, I think, I mean, as our organization, we try to communicate all of our projects in multiple different ways to target different audiences. We put a big focus on environmental education for youth as a component in all of our projects, but also as sort of standalone programs. So I think we try to get our information out in a way that is exciting and understandable to engage youth is kind of one of our biggest goals. We also present, a lot of our water quality programs do involve municipal governments. So we're quite often presenting program results to councils and working with staff there. So a lot of that information gets shared not just by ourselves, but also through our local governments.
Excellent, thanks. And Alice, anything interesting in your research? I know you weren't working probably at communication specifically, but anything stand out from you and maybe some of the groups that you spoke with?
Again, just coming back to the piece of like stakeholder engagement and communication from the ground level, right? So yeah, like building programs together with the end goal in mind and the end use in mind. I know I sound like a broken record, but building those programs with the end use in mind and communication through the process. And again, the target audience. And so just getting back to that question. And so, you know, if the end goal is education, again, that's if you're working with like younger kids, that's different, obviously, from, you know, whether you're working with government. And so this gets back to that pyramid of like different tiers of data, right? And so what you're collecting it for and how you present the data.
Awesome, thanks, Alice. So we're at time. I want to extend a huge thank you to all of you for joining us today. I think it's been really wonderful to hear about your experiences and can't thank you enough. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. We will be sharing a recording of this webinar. You can go to datastream.org/webinars to access the recording as well as see what else we have coming up. We're going to be taking a little bit of a break for the summer, but we'll be returning in the fall with a webinar on monitoring fish habitat, which I'm really looking forward to. Fish are fascinating creatures. So I'm looking forward to learning more from the presenters on that session. Also, a thank you to our regional partners and our supporters and to everybody who showed up today. Thank you.